The Guests of Mrs. TIMMS. A short story by Orne Jewett. Mrs. Persis. Flagg stood in her front doorway taking leave of Miss Cynthia Pickett, who had been making a long call. They were not intimate friends. Miss Pickett always came formally to the front door and rang when she paid her visits. But the week before, they had met at the county conference, and happened to be sent to the same house for entertainment, and so had deepened and renewed the pleasures of acquaintance. It was an afternoon in early June. The syringa bushes were tall and green on each side of the stone doorsteps, and were covered with their lovely white and golden flowers. Miss Pickett broke off the nearest twig and held it before her prim face as she talked. She had a pretty childlike smile that came and went suddenly, but her face was not one that bore the marks of many pleasures. Mrs. Flagg was a tall, commanding sort of person, with an air of satisfaction and authority. "Oh, yes, gather all you want," she said stiffly, as Miss Pickett took the syringa without having asked beforehand. But she had an amiable expression, and just now her large countenance was lighted up by pleasant anticipation. "We can tell early what sort of a day it's going to be," she said eagerly. "There ain't a cloud in the sky now. I'll stop for you as I come along, or if there should be anything unforeseen to detain me, I'll send you word. I don't expect you'd want to go if it weren't so that I could." "Oh, my sakes, no," answered Miss Pickett discreetly, with a timid flush. "You feel certain that Miss Timms won't be put out? I shouldn't feel free to go unless I went along o' you." "Why, nothing could be plainer than her words," said Mrs. Flagg in a tone of reproval. "You saw how she urged me, and had over all that talk about how we used to see each other often when we both lived to Longport, and told how she'd been thinking of writin', and asking if it wa'n't so I should be able to come over and stop 3 or 4 days as soon as settled weather come, because she couldn't make no fire in her best chamber on account of the chimbley smokin' if the wind wa'n't just right. You see how she felt toward me, kissin' of me comin' and goin'? Why, she even asked me who I employed to do over my bonnet, Miss Pickett, just as interested as if she was a sister, and she remarked she should look for us any pleasant day after we all got home and were settled after the conference." Miss Pickett smiled, but did not speak, as if she expected more argument still. "And she seemed just about as much gratified to meet with you again. She seemed to desire to meet you again very particular," continued Mrs. Flagg. "She really urged us to come together and have a real good day talking over old times. There, don't Lise go all over it again? I've always heard she'd made that old house of her Aunt Bascom's where she lives look real handsome. I once heard her best parlor carpet described as being an elegant carpet, different from any there was round here. Why, nobody couldn't be more cordial, Miss Pickett. You ain't going to give out just at the last?" "Oh, no," answered the visitor hastily. "No, I want to go full as much as you do, Miss Flagg. But you see, I never was so well acquainted with Miss Captain Timms, and I always seem to dread putting myself forward. She certain was very urgent, and she said plain enough to come any day next week. And here it is Wednesday, though of course she wouldn't look for us either Monday or Tuesday. 'Twill be a real pleasant occasion, and now we've been to the conference, it don't seem near so much effort to start." "Why, I don't think nothin' of it," said Mrs. Flagg proudly. "We shall have a grand good time, going together and all, I feel sure." Miss Pickett still played with her syringa flower, tapping her thin cheek and twirling the stem with her fingers. She looked as if she were going to say something more, but after a moment's hesitation she turned away. "Good afternoon, Miss Flagg," she said formally, looking up with a quick little smile. "I enjoyed my call. I hope I ain't kept you too late. I don't know but what it's most tea time. Well, I shall look for you in the morning." "Good afternoon, Miss Pickett. I'm glad I was in when you came. Call again, won't you?" said Mrs. Flagg. "Yes, you may expect me in good season." And so they parted. Miss Pickett went out at the neat clicking gate in the white fence, and Mrs. Flagg a moment later looked out of her sitting-room window to see if the gate were latched, and felt the least bit disappointed to find that it was. She sometimes went out after the departure of a guest, and fastened the gate herself with a loud, rebuking sound. Both of these Woodville women lived alone, and were very precise in their way of doing things. The next morning dawned clear and bright, and Miss Pickett rose even earlier than usual. She found it most difficult to decide which of her dresses would be best to wear. Summer was still so young that the day had all the freshness of spring, but when the two friends walked away together along the shady street, with a chorus of golden robins singing high overhead in the elms, Miss Pickett decided that she had made a wise choice of her second-best black silk gown, which she had just turned again and freshened. It was neither too warm for the season nor too cool, nor did it look overdressed. She wore her large cameo pin, and this, with a long watch chain, gave an air of proper mural decoration. She was a straight, flat little person, as if, when not in use, she kept herself, silk dress and all, between the leaves of a book. She carried a noticeable parasol with a fringe, and a small shawl, with a pretty border, neatly folded over her left arm. Mrs. Flagg always dressed in black cashmere, and looked, to hasty observers, much the same one day as another, but her companion recognized the fact that this was the best black cashmere of all, and for a moment quailed at the thought that Mrs. Flagg was paying such extreme deference to their prospective hostess. The visit turned for a moment into an unexpectedly solemn formality, and pleasure seemed to wane before Cynthia Pickett's eyes, yet with great courage she never slackened a single step. Mrs. Flagg carried a somewhat worn black leather handbag, which Miss Pickett regretted. It did not give the visit that casual and unpremeditated air which she felt to be more elegant. "Shan't I carry your bag for you?" she asked timidly. Mrs. Flagg was the older and more important person. "Oh, dear me, no," answered Mrs. Flagg. "My pocket's so remote, in case I should desire to sneeze or anything, that I thought it would be convenient for carrying my handkerchief and pocketbook, and then I just tucked in a couple of glasses of my crab-apple jelly for Miss TIMMS. She used to be a great hand for preserves of every sort, and I thought it would be a kind of an attention and give rise to conversation. I know she used to make excellent drop cakes when we was both residing to Longport. Folks used to say she never would give the right receipt, but if I get a real good chance, I mean to ask her. Or why can't you, if I start talking about receipts, why can't you say sort of innocent that I have always spoken frequently of her drop cakes, and ask for the rule? She would be very sensible to the compliment, and could pass it off if she didn't feel to indulge us. There, I do so wish you would." "Yes, said Miss Pickett doubtfully. "I'll try to make the opportunity. I'm very partial to drop cakes. Was they flour or rye, Miss Flagg?" "They was flour, dear," replied Mrs. Flagg approvingly, "crisp and light as any you ever see." "I wish I had thought to carry something to make it pleasant," said Miss Pickett, after they had walked a little farther. "But there, I don't know's 'twould look just right this first visit to offer anything to such a person as Miss TIMMS. In case I ever go over to Baxter again, I won't forget to make her some little present, as nice as I've got. 'Twas certain very polite of her to urge me to come with you. I did feel very doubtful at first. I didn't know, but she thought it behooved her, because I was in your company at the conference, and she wanted to save my feelin's, and yet expected I would decline. I never was well acquainted with her. Our folks wasn't well off when I first knew her. 'Twas before Uncle Captain Dyer passed away, and remembered Mother and me in his will. We couldn't make no handsome companies in them days, so we didn't go to none, and kept to ourselves. But in my grandmother's time, Mother always said, the families was very friendly. I shouldn't feel like going over to pass the day with Miss TIMMS if I didn't mean to ask her to return the visit. Some don't think of these things. But Mother was very set about not being done for when she couldn't make no return." "When it rains, porridge hold up your dish," said Mrs. Flagg. But Miss Pickett made no response beyond a feeble "yes'm," which somehow got caught in her pale green bonnet strings. "There, 'tain't no use to fuss too much over all them things," proclaimed Mrs. Flagg, walking along at a good pace with a fine sway of her skirts, and carrying her head high. "Folks walks right by and forgets all about you. Folks can't always be going through with just so much. You'd had a good deal better time, you and your ma, if you'd been freer in your ways. Now don't you suppose you would? 'Tain't what you give folks to eat so much as 'tis making 'em feel welcome. Now there's Miss TIMMS. When we was to Longport she was dreadful methodical. She wouldn't let Captain TIMMS fetch nobody home to dinner without lettin' of her know, same's other captains' wives had to submit to. I was thinking, when she was so cordial over to Danby, how she'd softened with time. Years do learn folks something. She did seem very pleasant and desirous. There, I am so glad we got started. If she'd gone and got up a real good dinner today and then not had us come till tomorrow, 'twould have been real too bad. Where anybody lives alone, such a thing is very tryin'." "Oh, so it is," said Miss Pickett. "There, I'd like to tell you what I went through with year before last. They come and asked me one Saturday night to entertain the minister. That time we was having candidates." "I guess we'd better step along faster," said Mrs. Flagg suddenly. "Why, Miss Pickett, there's the stage comin' now. It's dreadful prompt, seems to me. Quick. There's folks a-waitin', and I shan't get to Baxter in no state to visit Miss Cap'n Timms if I have to ride all the way there backward." The stage was not full inside. The group before the store proved to be made up of spectators, except one man, who climbed at once to a vacant seat by the driver. Inside there was only one person, after 2 passengers got out, and she preferred to sit with her back to the horses, so that Mrs. Flagg and Miss Pickett settled themselves comfortably in the coveted corners of the back seat. At first they took no notice of their companion, and spoke to each other in low tones, but presently something attracted the attention of all 3 and engaged them in conversation. "I never was over this road before," said the stranger. "I suppose you ladies are well acquainted all along. We have often traveled it in past years. We was over this part of it last week, goin' and comin' from the county conference," said Mrs. Flagg in a dignified manner. "What persuasion?" inquired the fellow traveler with interest. "Orthodox," said Miss Pickett quickly, before Mrs. Flagg could speak. "It was a very interestin' occasion. This other lady and me stayed through all the meetin's." "I ain't orthodox," announced the stranger, waiving any interest in personalities. "I was brought up amongst the Free Will Baptists." "We're well acquainted with several of that denomination in our place," said Mrs. Flagg, not without an air of patronage. "They've never built 'em no church. There ain't but a scattered few." "They prevail where I come from," said the traveler. "I'm goin' now to visit with a Free Will lady. We was to a conference together once, same's you and your friend, but it was a state conference. She asked me to come some time and make her a good visit, and I'm on my way now. I didn't seem to have nothing to keep me to home." "We're all goin' visitin' today, ain't we?" said Mrs. Flagg sociably. But no one carried on the conversation. The day was growing very warm. There was dust in the sandy road, but the fields of grass and young growing crops looked fresh and fair. There was a light haze over the hills, and birds were thick in the air. When the stage horses stopped to walk, you could hear the crows caw and the bobolinks singing in the meadows. All the farmers were busy in their fields. "It don't seem but little ways to Baxter, does it?" said Miss Pickett after a while. "I felt we should pass a good deal of time on the road, but we must be pretty near halfway there already." "Why, more'n half," exclaimed Mrs. Flagg. "Yes, there's Beckett's corner right ahead, and the old Beckett house. I haven't been on this part of the road for so long that I feel kind of strange. I used to visit over here when I was a girl. There's a nephew's widow owns the place now. Old Miss Susan Beckett willed it to him, and he died. But she resides there and carries on the farm. An unusual smart woman, everybody says. Ain't it pleasant here, right out among the farms?" "Miss Beckett's place, did you observe?" said the stranger, leaning forward to listen to what her companion said. "I expect that's where I'm goin'. Miss Ezra Beckett's?" "That's the one," said Miss Pickett and Mrs. Flagg together, and they both looked out eagerly as the coach drew up to the front door of a large old yellow house that stood close upon the green turf of the roadside. The passenger looked pleased and eager, and made haste to leave the stage with her many bundles and bags. While she stood impatiently tapping at the brass knocker, the stage driver landed a large trunk and dragged it toward the door across the grass. Just then a busy-looking middle-aged woman made her appearance, with flowery hands and a look as if she were prepared to be somewhat on the defensive. "Why, how do you do, Miss Beckett?" exclaimed the guest. "Well, here I be at last. I didn't know's you thought I was ever comin'. Why, I do declare I believe you don't recognize me, Miss Beckett." "I believe I don't," said the self-possessed hostess. "Ain't you made some mistake, ma'am?" "Why, don't you recollect we was together that time to the state conference, and you said you should be pleased to have me come and make you a visit sometime, and I said I would certain, There, I expect I look more natural to you now." Mrs. Beckett appeared to be making the best possible effort and gave a bewildered glance, first at her unexpected visitor and then at the trunk. The stage driver, who watched this encounter with evident delight, turned away with reluctance. "I can't wait all day to see how they settle it," he said, and mounted briskly to the box, and the stage rolled on. "He might have waited just a minute to see," said Miss Pickett indignantly, but Mrs. Flagg's head and shoulders were already far out of the stage window. The house was on her side. "She ain't got in yet," she told Miss Pickett triumphantly. "I could see him quite a spell, with that trunk too. I do declare how inconsiderate some folks is." "'Twas pushin' an acquaintance most too far, wa'n't it?" agreed Miss Pickett. "There, 'twill be something laughable to tell Miss Timms. I never see anything more divertin'. I shall kind of pity that woman if we have to stop and get her as we go back this afternoon." "Oh, don't let's forget to watch for her," exclaimed Mrs. Flagg, beginning to brush off the dust of travel. "There, I feel an excellent appetite, don't you? And we ain't got more'n 3 or 4 miles to go if we have that. I wonder what Miss Timms is likely to give us for dinner. She spoke of making a good many chicken pies, and I happened to remark how partial I was to 'em. She felt above most of the things we had provided for us over to the conference. I know she was always counted the best of cooks when I knew her so well to Longport. Now don't you forget, if there's a suitable opportunity to inquire about the drop cakes." And Miss Pickett, a little less doubtful than before, renewed her promise. "My gracious, won't Miss Timms be pleased to see us? It's just exactly the day to have company. And ain't Baxter a sweet, pretty place?" said Mrs. Flagg as they walked up the main street. "Cynthia Pickett, now ain't you proper glad you come? I felt sort of calm about it part of the time yesterday, but I ain't felt so like a girl for a good while. I do believe I'm going to have a splendid time." Miss Pickett glowed with equal pleasure as she paced along. She was less expansive and enthusiastic than her companion, but now that they were fairly in Baxter, she lent herself generously to the occasion. The social distinction of going away to spend a day in company with Mrs. Flagg was by no means small. She arranged the folds of her shawl more carefully over her arm so as to show the pretty palm-leaf border, and then looked up with great approval to the row of great maples that shaded the broad sidewalk. "I wonder if we can't contrive to make time to go and see old Miss Nancy Fell," she ventured to ask Mrs. Flagg. "There ain't a great deal of time before the stage goes at 4 o'clock. 'Twill pass quickly, but I should hate to have her feel hurt. If she was one we had visited often at home, I shouldn't care so much, but such folks feel any little slight. She was a member of our church. I think a good deal of that." "Well, I hardly know what to say," faltered Mrs. Flagg coldly. "We might just look in a minute. I shouldn't want her to feel hurt." "She was one that always did her part, too," said Miss Pickett more boldly. "Mr. Cronin used to say that she was more generous with her little than many was with their much. If she hadn't lived in a poor part of the town, and so been occupied with a different kind of people from us, 'twould have made a difference. They say she's got a comfortable little home over here, and keeps house for a nephew. You know she was to our meeting one Sunday last winter and 'peared dreadful glad to get back. Folks seemed glad to see her, too. I don't know as you were out." "She always wore a friendly look," said Mrs. Flagg indulgently. "There now, there's Miss Timms's residence. It's handsome, ain't it, with them big spruce trees? I expect she may be at the window now and see us as we come along. Is my bonnet on straight and everything? The blinds looks open in the room this way. I guess she's to home fast enough." The friends quickened their steps, and with shining eyes and beating hearts hastened forward. The slightest mists of uncertainty were now cleared away. They gazed at the house with deepest pleasure. The visit was about to begin. They opened the front gate and went up the short walk, noticing the pretty herringbone pattern of the bricks, and as they stood on the high steps, Cynthia Pickett wondered whether she ought not to have worn her best dress, even though there was lace at the neck and sleeves, and she usually kept it for the most formal of tea parties and exceptional parish festivals. In her heart, she commended Mrs. Flagg for that familiarity with the ways of a wider social world which had led her to wear the very best among her black cashmeres. "She's a good while coming to the door," whispered Mrs. Flagg presently. "Either she didn't see us, or else she's slipped upstairs to make some change, and is just going to let us ring again. I've done it myself sometimes. I'm glad we come right over after her urging us so. It seems more cordial than to keep her expecting us. I expect she'll urge us terribly to remain with her overnight." "Oh, I ain't prepared," began Miss Pickett, but she looked pleased. At that moment there was a slow withdrawal of the bolt inside, and a key was turned, the front door opened, and Mrs. Timms stood before them with a smile. Nobody stopped to think at that moment what kind of smile it was. "Why, if it ain't Miss Flagg!" she exclaimed politely, "and Miss Pickett, too! I am surprised." The front entry behind her looked well furnished, but not exactly hospitable. The stairs with their brass rods looked so clean and bright that it did not seem as if anybody had ever gone up or come down. A cat came purring out, but Mrs. Timms pushed her back with a determined foot and hastily closed the sitting-room door. Then Miss Pickett let Mrs. Flagg precede her, as was becoming, and they went into a darkened parlor and found their way to some chairs, and seated themselves solemnly. "'Tis a beautiful day, ain't it?" said Mrs. Flagg, speaking first. "I don't know's I ever enjoyed the ride more. We've been having a good deal of rain since we saw you at the conference, and the country looks beautiful." "Did you leave Woodville this morning?" "I thought I hadn't heard you was in town," replied Mrs. Timms formally. She was seated just a little too far away to make things seem exactly pleasant. The darkness of the best room seemed to retreat somewhat, and Miss Pickett looked over by the door, where there was a pale gleam from the side lights in the hall, to try to see the pattern of the carpet, but her effort failed. "Yes, replied Mrs. Flagg to the question. "We left Woodville about 8:30, but it is quite a ways from where we live to where you take the stage. The stage does come slow, but you don't seem to mind it such a beautiful day." "Why, you must have come right to see me first," said Mrs. Timms, warming a little as the visit went on. "I hope you're going to make some stop in town. I'm sure it was very polite of you to come right and see me. Well, it's very pleasant, I declare. I wish you'd been in Baxter last Sabbath. Our minister did give us an elegant sermon on faith and works. He spoke of the conference and gave his views on some of the questions that came up at Friday evening meeting. But I felt tired after getting home, and so I wasn't out. We feel very much favored to have such a man amongst us. He's building up the parish very considerable. I understand the pew rents come to $36 more this quarter than they did last. We also feel grateful in Woodville for our pastor's efforts," said Miss Pickett. But Mrs. Timms turned her head away sharply, as if the speech had been untimely, and trembling Miss Pickett had interrupted. "They're thinking here of raising Mr. Barlow's salary another year," the hostess added. "A good many of the old parishioners have died off, but everyone feels to do what they can. Is there much interest among the young people in Woodville, Miss Flagg?" "Considerable at this time, ma'am," answered Mrs. Flagg, without enthusiasm, and she listened with unusual silence to the subsequent fluent remarks of Mrs. Timms. The parlor seemed to be undergoing the slow processes of a winter dawn. After a while the three women could begin to see one another's faces, which aided them somewhat in carrying on a serious and impersonal conversation. There were a good many subjects to be touched upon, and Mrs. Timms said everything that she should have said, except to invite her visitors to walk upstairs and take off their bonnets. Mrs. Flagg sat her parlor chair as if it were a throne, and carried her banner of self-possession as high as she knew how. But toward the end of the call, even she began to feel hurried. "Won't you ladies take a glass of wine and a piece of cake after your ride?" inquired Mrs. Timms, with an air of hospitality that almost concealed the fact that neither cake nor wine was anywhere to be seen. But the ladies bowed and declined with particular elegance. Altogether, it was a visit of extreme propriety on both sides, and Mrs. Timms was very pressing in her invitation that her guests should stay longer. "Thank you, but we ought to be going," answered Mrs. Flagg with a little show of ostentation, and looking over her shoulder to be sure that Miss Pickett had risen too. "We've got some little ways to go," she added with dignity. "We should be pleased to have you call and see us in case you have occasion to come to Woodville," and Miss Pickett faintly seconded the invitation. It was in her heart to add, "Come any day next week," but her courage did not rise so high as to make the words audible. She looked as if she were ready to cry. Her usual smile had burnt itself out into gray ashes. There was a white, appealing look about her mouth. As they emerged from the dim parlor and stood at the open front door, the bright June day, the golden-green trees, almost blinded their eyes. Mrs. TIMMS was more smiling and cordial than ever. "There, I ought to have thought to offer you fans. I'm afraid you was warm after walking," she exclaimed, as if to leave no stone of courtesy unturned. "I have so enjoyed meeting you again. I wish it was so you could stop longer. Why, Miss Flagg, we haven't said one word about old times when we lived to Longport. I've had news from there, too, since I saw you. My brother's daughter-in-law was here to pass the Sabbath after I returned." Mrs. Flagg did not turn back to ask any questions as she stepped stiffly away down the brick walk. Miss Pickett followed her, raising the fringed parasol. They both made ceremonious little bows as they shut the high white gate behind them. "Goodbye," said Mrs. TIMMS finally as she stood in the door with her set smile. And as they departed, she came out and began to fasten up a rose bush that climbed a narrow white ladder by the steps. "Oh, my goodness alive!" exclaimed Mrs. Flagg, after they had gone some distance in aggrieved silence. "If I haven't gone and forgotten my bag, I ain't going back, whatever happens. I expect she'll trip over it in that dark room and break her neck." "I brought it. I noticed you'd forgotten it," said Miss Pickett timidly, as if she hated to deprive her companion of even that slight consolation. "There, I'll tell you what we'd better do," said Mrs. Flagg gallantly. "We'll go right over and see poor old Miss Nancy Fell. 'Twill please her about to death. We can say we felt like going somewhere today, and was a good many years since either one of us had seen Baxter, so we come just for the ride and to make a few calls. She'll like to hear all about the conference. Miss Fell was always one that took a real interest in religious matters." Miss Pickett brightened, and they quickened their step. It was nearly noon, they had breakfasted early, and now felt as if they had eaten nothing since they were grown up. An awful feeling of tiredness and uncertainty settled down upon their once buoyant spirits. "I can forgive a person," said Mrs. Flagg once, as if she were speaking to herself. "I can forgive a person, but when I'm done with 'em, I'm done. I do declare 'twas like a scene in Scripture to see that poor good-hearted Nancy Fell run down her walk to open the gate for us," said Mrs. Persis Flagg later that afternoon when she and Miss Pickett were going home in the stage. Miss Pickett nodded her head approvingly. "I had a good sight better time with her than I should have had at the other place," she said with fearless honesty. "If I'd been Miss Cap'n Timms, I'd made some apology or just passed us the compliment. If it wa'n't convenient, why couldn't she just tell us so after all her urgin' and sayin' how she should expect us?" "I thought then she'd altered from what she used to be," said Mrs. Flagg. "She seemed real sincere and open away from home. If she wa'n't prepared today, 'twas easy enough to say so. We was reasonable folks, and should have gone away with none but friendly feelin's. We did have a grand good time with Nancy. She was as happy to see us as if we'd been queens." "'Twas a real nice little dinner," said Miss Pickett gratefully. "I thought I was going to faint away just before we got to the house, and I didn't know how I should hold out if she undertook to do anything extra and keep us a-waitin'. But there, she just made us welcome, simple-hearted to what she had. I never tasted such dandelion greens. And that nice little piece of pork and new biscuit, why, they was just splendid. She must have an excellent good cellar if 'tis such a small house. Her potatoes was truly remarkable for this time of year. I myself don't deem it necessary to cook potatoes when I'm going to have dandelion greens. Now, didn't it put you in mind of that verse in the Bible that says, 'Better is a dinner of herbs where love is'? And how desirous she'd been to see somebody that could tell her some particulars about the conference. She'll enjoy telling folks about our coming over to see her. Yes, I'm glad we went. 'Twill be of advantage every way, and our being of the same church and all, to Woodville. If Miss Timms hears of our being there, she'll see we had reason, and knew of a place to go. Well, I needn't have brought this old bag." Miss Pickett gave her companion a quick, resentful glance, which was followed by one of triumph directed at the dust that was collecting on the shoulders of the best black cashmere. Then she looked at the bag on the front seat and suddenly felt illuminated with the suspicion that Mrs. Flagg had secretly made preparations to pass the night in Baxter. The bag looked plump, as if it held much more than the pocketbook and the jelly. Mrs. Flagg looked up with unusual humility. "I did think about that jelly," she said, as if Miss Pickett had openly reproached her. "I was afraid it might look as if I was trying to pay Nancy for her kindness." "Well, I don't know," said Cynthia. "I guess she'd been pleased. She'd thought you just brought her over a little present, but I don't know as it would been any good to her after all. She'd thought so much of it, comin' from you, that she'd kep' it till 'twas all candied." But Mrs. Flagg didn't look exactly pleased by this unexpected compliment, and her fellow traveler colored with confusion and a sudden feeling that she had shown undue forwardness. Presently they remembered the Beckett house, to their great relief, and as they approached, Mrs. Flagg reached over and moved her handbag from the front seat to make room for another passenger. But nobody came out to stop the stage, and they saw the unexpected guest sitting by one of the front windows, comfortably swaying a palm leaf fan and rocking to and fro in calm content. They shrank back into their corners and tried not to be seen. Mrs. Flagg's face grew very red. "She got in, didn't she?" said Miss Pickett, snipping her words angrily as if her lips were scissors. Then she heard a call and bent forward to see Mrs. Beckett herself appear in the front doorway, very smiling and eager to stop the stage. The driver was only too ready to stop his horses. "Got a passenger for me to carry back, ain't ye?" said he facetiously. "Them's the kind I like. Carry both ways, make something on a double trip." And he gave Mrs. Flagg and Miss Pickett a friendly wink as he stepped down over the wheel. Then he hurried toward the house, evidently in a hurry to put the baggage on. But the expected passenger still sat rocking and fanning at the window. "No, sir, I ain't got any passengers," exclaimed Mrs. Beckett, advancing a step or two to meet him, and speaking very loud in her pleasant excitement. "This lady that come this morning wants her large trunk with her summer things that she left to the depot in Woodville. She's very desirous to get into it, so don't you go and forget. Ain't you got a book or something, Mr. Mosh? Don't you forget to make a note of it. Here's her check, and we've kept the number in case you should mislay it or anything. There's things in the trunk she needs. You know how you overlooked stoppin' to the milliner's for my bunnet last week." "Other folks disremembers things as well's me," grumbled Mr. Marsh. He turned to give the passengers another wink more familiar than the first, but they wore an offended air and were looking the other way. The horses had backed a few steps, and the guest at the front window had ceased the steady motion of her fan to make them a handsome bow, and been puzzled at the lofty manner of their acknowledgment. "Go along with your foolish jokes, John Mosh," Mrs. Beckett said cheerfully as she turned away. She was a comfortable, hearty person, whose appearance adjusted the beauties of hospitality. The driver climbed to his seat, chuckling, and drove away with the dust flying after the wheels. "Now, she's a friendly sort of a woman, that Miss Beckett," said Mrs. Flagg unexpectedly, after a few moments of silence, when she and her friend had been unable to look at each other. "I really ought to call over and see her some of these days, knowing her husband's folks as well as I used to, and visitin' of 'em when I was a girl." But Miss Pickett made no answer. "I expect it was all for the best, that woman's comin'," suggested Mrs. Flagg again hopefully. She looked like a willing person who would take right hold. I guess Miss Beckett knows what she's about and must have had her reasons. Perhaps she thought she'd chance it for a couple of weeks anyway, after the lady'd come so fur, and be in one of her own denomination. Hay and time will be here before we know it. I think myself, generally speaking, 'tis just as well to let anybody know you're comin'. "Them seem to be Miss Captain Timms's views," said Miss Pickett in a low tone. But the stage rattled a good deal, and Mrs. Flagg looked up inquiringly, as if she had not heard.